In today's lecture, we're going to focus on the history of Native Americans in North America. I will provide an overview of a huge span of time in Native American history, from about 20,000 years ago until the year 1900. The purpose of this lecture is not only to focus on the story of Native Americans in North America, but also to reflect on the key turning points in United States history that led to the essential destruction of the Native American way of life. The history of Native Americans in the United States is a sorrowful tale, a deeply unjust and tragic story that led largely to the literal destruction of much of that population on this continent. Let's start with a little ancient history about Native Americans. Now, obviously, Christopher Columbus did not discover the New World for all humanity when he sailed the ocean blue in 1492. All Columbus really did was start a process that brought Europeans and Africans into contact with a thriving native population in the Western Hemisphere. The first human beings to live in North America, what we should term the very first Native Americans, came to this continent approximately 50 to 20,000 years ago. No one is certain of the exact date. Some even argue that human beings lived in North America 30,000 years ago. The continent's first human beings, which are called Paleo-Indians, likely crossed over the Bering Strait from Asia, leaving modern-day Russia, and came to North America through modern-day Alaska before migrating south over many thousands of years. Keep in mind that 20,000 years ago, North America and the world at large was much, much colder than it is today. Huge glaciers covered most of western Canada down to Illinois and Ohio, and as much of the world's water was frozen, ocean levels were hundreds of feet shallower. This created a land bridge from the Bering Strait from today's eastern Russia to today's Alaskan Peninsula that the first human beings crossed over on foot. When those first human beings first came to North America in small groups over many years, they hunted woolly mammoths and mastodons to survive. These first people formed nomadic groups that hunted and slowly but surely migrated from the very top of North America down to the southernmost tip of South America. Now, the history of these ancient Native Americans is very relevant for understanding the Native Americans that Europeans would first encounter in the late 1400s. To explain what I mean, when the first human beings crossed over into North America, they eventually became totally isolated from much else of the world's population over the following millenniums. This happened because about 12,000 years ago, the Earth began to warm, melting major ice sheets across the planet and making the oceans deeper. As that occurred, the land bridge from the Bering Strait to Alaska became covered by deep water, making it impossible for future human beings in Asia to come to North America. Thereafter, Native Americans living in North America had no contact with human beings on other continents for thousands and thousands of years, likely not until Europeans began to arrive in the New World in the late 1400s. Over those thousands of years, human beings in the Americas slowly developed different immune systems as a result of their natural environment. For instance, the first residents of North America, unlike other continents, were never exposed to diseases like smallpox and measles that haunted Europeans. The first Americans also didn't raise livestock, like pigs and cattle, since they were largely nomadic hunters. And that lack of close interaction with farm animals changed the diseases they were exposed to, compared to the rest of the world. This different immune system would have deadly consequences when the first Europeans arrived in the New World. However, the first Paleo-Indians did have a huge supply of animals to hunt. With lots of meat available, their populations grew rapidly. Paleo-Indians hunted woolly mammoths and horses into extinction in the Americas. That's right, Native Americans would not ride horses until Spanish settlers brought them back to the New World around 1547. These first Native American tribes not only survived on meat from hunting, but they also ate fish, nuts, and berries. About 5,000 years ago, Native Americans began growing crops for the first time, cultivating corn, squash, and beans, plants that originated out of central Mexico. Thereafter, larger native tribes came into existence. For example, around 500 BC, a huge Native American civilization called the Aznazi lived in the Chaco Canyon on the San Juan River in present-day New Mexico. Their numbers are thought to have consisted of some 15,000 people over 70 different villages. They grew crops and developed agricultural canals to carry water to their fields. Many large tribes likely emerged in the Americas from 500 BC to 1400 AD. Two of the most famous that lived in South and Central America were the Incas and Aztecs, respectively. Forgive me for not going into detail about them. Their vibrant civilizations would take an entire semester to cover. In North America, any large native civilizations that existed eventually turned into thousands of smaller tribes, probably as a consequence of population growth, food scarcity, and warfare among different tribes. While many debates remain about which Europeans first came to the New World first, we can speak with certainty that Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean in 1492 heralded a new age in world history. Columbus, an explorer from northern Italy, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean with 3 ships on behalf of the Spanish monarchy. In 1492, he and his men encountered Native Americans in the Caribbean and the present-day Bahama Islands. In 1492, historians believe 4 million to 5 million Native Americans lived in North and South America. An estimated 900,000 lived in North America alone. Following Columbus's explorations in the Caribbean region, in the early 1500s, other Spanish settlers began to explore the southeastern United States, including the Gulf Coast and Florida, as well as the rest of South America. Starting in 1585, British settlers arrived in North America, colonizing Virginia, and then Massachusetts in the early 1600s. As you can guess, these European settlers encountered a huge variety of Native American cultures that spoke many different dialects. Keep in mind, Native Americans at that time did not see themselves as belonging to any larger ethnic group of quote-unquote Indians per se. Rather, they viewed themselves as members of their unique individual tribes. There was no Native American identity as we know it today. Here is a brief quote by a Spanish explorer that encountered a Native American in Florida for the first time around 1540. Recording that moment, he noted that there was a sense of utter confusion and bewilderment between them, writing, quote, "The things that seldom happen bring astonishment. Think then what must be the effect on me and mine, the sight of you and your people, whom we have at no time seen. Things altogether so new as to strike awe and terror into our hearts." In those first encounters, starting at the end of the 1400s, a process of material exchanges and trading began between Native Americans and Europeans. This is called the Columbian Exchange. In trading with Europeans, Native Americans received new metal goods, including knives and eventually guns, and animals like pigs, sheep, cattle, and horses that changed their lives. Europeans received beaver skins and other fur items, and new food plants like corn, squash, tomatoes, and potatoes that would be brought back to Europe. One Native American in Virginia, where British explorers began arriving in the last years of the 1500s, recalled, quote, "The English have no sense. They give us 20 knives for this one beaver skin," end quote. Europeans, for their part, struggled to communicate with Native Americans and often used sign language to convey basic messages in the first decades of exploration. In his first trip to the New World, Christopher Columbus vented his frustration over the language problem, saying, quote, "I did not understand those people nor they me, except for what common sense dictated, although they were saddened, and I much more so, because I wanted to have information concerning everything." While these first interactions were assuredly fascinating, they quickly became tragic for Native Americans. With the arrival of European explorers came European diseases that ransacked entire native populations. Smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated whole tribes. For instance, the native tribes that greeted Christopher Columbus in the Bahamas were largely all dead from European diseases within 20 years of those first contacts. Other Native American communities in Massachusetts suffered enormous plagues from diseases brought from overseas. Historians estimate that Native American tribes that first encountered Europeans in the 1500s and early 1600s lost 90 to 95% of their populations from diseases within a century. One Massachusetts colonist stated in 1630 of these mass deaths among Native Americans, quote, "They were swept away by a great and grievous plague, so that there are very few left to inhabit the country," end quote. Europeans, culturally ignorant, often viewed this enormous death toll as, quote, "the hand of God," end quote, clearing the land for European settlement. This quote brings us to an important point. From the beginning of their explorations in the Western Hemisphere, Europeans proclaimed themselves superior to Native Americans and sought to, quote, "civilize them," end quote. Acting out of a mixture of ignorance and cultural hubris, Europeans, often through brute force, began a centuries-long process of attempting to force Native Americans to dress like Europeans, to adopt Christianity, to attend white schools, and to change their way of living altogether. Of course, most Native Americans had little interest in adhering to European customs. Here's an interesting example from the 18th century that demonstrates why. In the mid-1700s, the colony of Virginia offered some members of the Iroquois tribe a free college education at William and Mary. The Iroquois tribe leaders, however, quickly rejected the offer, saying that those who went came back, quote, "absolutely good for nothing, being neither acquainted with the true methods of killing deer, catching beaver, or surprising an enemy." This demonstrates how much the interaction of Europeans and Native Americans represented two absolutely different ways of life. Native American tribes, generally speaking, lived in far more egalitarian communities than Europeans. Both genders worked. The men hunted and the women grew crops for subsistence. Native American tribes did not believe in land ownership. They thought the possibility of owning any patch of land ridiculous. They were, in comparison to Europeans, what we might call leavers. For the most part, they used only what they needed from the earth. Europeans, however, came to the New World and immediately began to set up colonies with land titles. Families wanted to own private land rather than share it with the community. They burned and cleared forests, though Native Americans sometimes did this too, so they could grow crops not only to eat but also to sell for profits. Native Americans, to the contrary, hunted in wooded areas and grew crops for subsistence needs, to feed their families, not to sell and collect wealth. Let's move ahead and discuss Native Americans in the United States more specifically. The roughly 300 years of interactions between Native Americans and European descendants in America from 1600 to 1900 turned into almost a continuous war against Native American tribes. Over that time span, Native Americans were constantly pushed further and further west in what would become the United States to make room for white settlers. By 1900, the Native American way of life and much of their population had been destroyed. By the beginning of the 20th century, Native American tribes had been forced onto small, desolate reservations with little to no economic mobility and low standards of living. Here are some important statistics on this transformation. An estimated 900,000 Native Americans lived in North America when British settlers arrived. By the year 1800, there were only 600,000. By the 1890s, just 250,000 Native Americans were left in the United States. Keep in mind that Native American numbers should have increased dramatically based on natural childbirths alone. Today, according to the most recent census, Native Americans make up just 0.09% of the American population, about 2.25 million people out of more than 311 million living in the United States. So the ultimate question is, how did this enormous tragedy happen? The answer is not all that complex. Generally speaking, over approximately 300 years, white settlers and then the federal government repeatedly signed treaties with Native Americans and then broke those treaties, seizing more and more lands. White settlers constantly fought wars against Native Americans, and the tribes also fought amongst themselves. Simply said, European settlers and then U.S. citizens steadily pushed Native American communities to the brink of destruction. After the creation of the United States in 1776, Our government fought no less than 40 wars against Native American tribes over the coming century. These conflicts led to the deaths of an estimated 30,000 Native Americans and some 19,000 white men, women, and children. Of course, these conflicts witnessed countless massacres on both sides involving men, women, and children. However, what we can broadly say is that these conflicts continue to happen as a result of unremitting white settler expansion into Native American lands, and as a result of ideas among U.S. citizens, like manifest destiny, that the United States was destined to control the whole continent from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. U.S. citizens, like the first European explorers, also viewed Native Americans as backwards and in need of, quote, civilization, end quote, including Christianity and a European-style education. During the Revolutionary War, most Native Americans sided with the British because they hoped that a British victory would prevent further expansion west by American settlers. After the end of that conflict, Britain gave away large amounts of land in the Ohio Territory, including today's Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where Native American tribes lived. Soon after, Native tribes in that region fought and lost what was called the Northwest Indian War from 1785 to 1795. As a result, they were steadily pushed out of the Ohio Territory. What also happened after the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 was the beginning of an endless number of treaties with individual tribes that white settlers and the federal government would break over and over and over again, forcing Native Americans further and further west. Some American leaders like George Washington and Henry Knox wanted permanent treaties that would actually preserve Indian lands. These leaders had some respect for Native communities, though even Washington believed European civilization and American way of life superior to Native communities. Thus, from the beginning of the United States, there was a continued quest to, quote, civilize Native Americans and convince them to join U.S. society and embrace the country's white culture. For instance, the federal government urged Native Americans to adopt the practice of private property, to build homes, to grow crops, and to educate their children and embrace Christianity. This quest to assimilate Native Americans into the country became the U.S. goal in the decades after the Revolutionary War. The federal government did, however, treat Native American tribes as separate nations they hoped would be gradually assimilated into U.S. culture. Presidents like Thomas Jefferson emphasized this approach to natives in the eastern and southern areas of the United States. In December 1803, Jefferson wrote to the Choctaw tribe, quote, I rejoice, brothers, to hear you propose to become cultivators of the earth for the maintenance of your families. Be assured you will support them better and with less labor by raising stock and bread, and by spinning and weaving clothes than by hunting. A little land cultivated and a little labor will procure more provisions than the most successful hunt, and a woman will clothe more by spinning and weaving than a man by hunting. Compared with you, we are but as of yesterday in this land. Yet, see, how much more we have multiplied by industry and the exercise of that reason which you possess in common with us. Follow then our example, brethren, and we will aid you with great pleasure. End quote. In 1819, the U.S. government passed what was called the, quote, Civilization Fund Act of 1819, end quote. This law gave organizations money to offer educational opportunities to native tribes and teach them English. The act stated that, quote, that for the purpose of guarding against the further decline and final extinction of the Indian tribes adjoining the frontier settlements of the United States, are for introducing among them the habits and arts of civilization. However, within 20 years, the federal government adopted a new strategy. For instance, President James Monroe, president from 1817 to 1825, announced a more aggressive assimilation policy that would move away from accepting Native American tribes as separate nations. Let me read briefly from Monroe's inaugural address in 1821. Quote, we have treated Native Americans as independent nations without their having any substantial pretensions to that rank. The distinction has flattered their pride, retarded their improvement, and in many instances paved the way to their destruction. The progress of our settlements westward, supported as they are by a dense population, has constantly driven them back. We should become their real benefactors. We should perform the office of their great father, the endearing title which they emphatically give to the chief magistrate of our Union. Their sovereignty over vast territories should cease, in lieu of which the right of soil should be secured to each individual and his posterity in competent portions. And for the territory thus ceded by each tribe, some reasonable equivalent should be granted to be vested in permanent funds for the support of civil government over them, and for the education of their children, for their instruction in the arts of husbandry, and to provide sustenance for them until they can provide it for themselves. This address reveals the condescending manner that U.S. presidents and citizens viewed Native Americans. Citizens, some acting from genuine benevolence, and others from more nefarious mindsets, sought to transform Native American cultures to get them to adopt European-style customs. U.S. citizens proved incapable of any greater cultural sensitivity and perspective that respected the societal differences in Native American communities. Let's discuss some major Native American tribes in the southeastern United States in the 1820s and 1830s, when President Monroe made this speech. While small Native tribes had largely been pushed out of the Northeast as autonomous societies, we can speak of 5 major Native American nations in the southeastern U.S. that were called the, quote, 5 civilized tribes, end quote. Living in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, these tribes were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. They became known as the 5 civilized tribes because most of their members had adopted some form of U.S. customs, including growing crops, using slaves, and having a republican form of government within their tribes. These tribes made a special effort to embrace U.S.-style customs as Thomas Jefferson had urged them. Regardless of those efforts, by the 1830s, white settlers were increasingly encroaching on the lands of these 5 nations in the South. State governments there often refused to cooperate in protecting these native lands, seeing them as an impediment to progress in terms of economic development, and they illegally passed laws against them. Each of the tribes responded differently to these white encroachments. The Cherokee tribe, for example, was the largest of the 5 tribes and adopted the growing of large amounts of crops and had even taken on slaves. After 1827, the Cherokee Nation had also formed a republican form of government with an executive, judiciary, and legislative branch modeled after the U.S. Constitution. They primarily chose to fight white encroachments of their lands in the U.S. court system. The Seminole Nation, another major tribe, was based in Florida. Though they were the smallest of the 5 major tribes, they repeatedly chose armed resistance to white expansion into their areas. They fought 2 major wars with the United States in between 1817 and 1842, as white settlers increasingly pushed them out of Florida. The Seminoles largely refused to accept American customs and often provided safe haven to runaway slave communities that allied with them. When Seminole Indians did own slaves, they often let them live independently in their own communities, only demanding a yearly portion of their crop. As we know from our previous lecture on President Andrew Jackson's time in office, these 5 native nations were forcibly removed from their lands in southeastern America to Oklahoma from 1830 to 1838. The Jackson administration supported the forcible removal of 46,000 Native Americans, including much of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, and Choctaw tribes, from parts of Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. The movement of the Cherokee tribe in particular became known as the Trail of Tears, in which 4,000 of some 16,000 people died from starvation, disease, and exposure, while being forced to move to a new territory in Oklahoma. At the same time as these incidents occurred, remaining Native American tribes in the Ohio Valley were pushed west of the Mississippi River after a conflict called Black Hawk's War. Let's move ahead and discuss some major events with Native Americans that occurred from the 1830s until the decades after the Civil War. By the end of the Civil War in 1865, Native Americans lived almost completely west of the Mississippi River. Within just 15 years after that, Native tribes had been forced off those vast lands onto desolate reservations largely without fertile soil. In 1865, around 250,000 Native Americans lived in the western half of the United States. This included many tribes originally from the east that had been forced onto reservations in Oklahoma. In the southwest, Native tribes included the Hopi, Zuni, Rio Grande, Pueblo, Apache, Comanche, and Navajo tribes, among many others. In the Pacific Northwest, tribes included the Klamath, the Chinook, the Yurok, and Shasta tribes. There were also vibrant tribal communities in the Great Plains, including the Sioux of the Dakotas, the Blackfoot of Idaho and Montana, the Cheyenne, Crow, and Arapaho of the Central Plains, and the Pawnee of western Nebraska. However, from 1860 to 1900, American settlers pushed further and further into these areas, bringing devastation to Native American lands. From 1870 to 1900, new states would rise in Colorado, Washington, Montana, the Dakotas, Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. Territories would be formed in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. But in turn, the last remaining lands that Native Americans had lived on and hunted on for thousands of years would be lost to them. Of all these tribes, Native American communities in the Great Plains were the largest. They had to deal most with the expansion of white settlers in the late 1860s. In that decade, 2/3 of the country's native population lived in the Great Plains. These plains tribes were nomadic. Riding horses was a way of life. They largely lived off of hunting buffalo and used horses to do so. While nomadic tribes in the plains consisted of many thousands of people altogether, most broke up into smaller subunits of 300 to 500 to hunt and live off a buffalo. For the tribes of the plains, the buffalo was also a way of life. The animal provided food, clothing, and shelter. They used every part. The meat was dried. The skin of the buffalo was used for teepees, blankets, and robes. The bones were used as knives. Tendons were used as bowstrings. Horns and hooves could be boiled into glue. They even used buffalo manure to fuel their fires. Let's speak briefly about the policies of the federal government with Native Americans before and after the Civil War. Before that conflict, many in the U.S. government had seen the land west of the Mississippi River, not including Louisiana, Texas, or Arkansas, as one large native reservation, often referring to it as Indian country. An 1834 law called the, quote, Indian Non-Intercourse Act, end quote, said that Native Americans would be allowed to live west of the Mississippi River, and that white settlers would be prohibited from entering, quote, Indian territory, end quote, without a license. By the 1850s, however, white settlers increasingly ignored that law and moved west in droves. In 1851, the federal government officially abandoned the notion of, quote, one big reservation in favor of a policy of pushing Native Americans onto smaller lands and greater concentrations. In this manner, the federal government gave specific boundaries to major tribes. The Sioux were given the Dakota country north of the Platte River, the Crow tribe a large area near the Powder River in Wyoming and Montana, and the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes were given the Colorado foothills near the North Platte and Arkansas rivers. However, this concentration policy didn't work. It ignored the fact that these native tribes were nomadic and subsisted off of hunting roaming buffalo herds that did not remain in any set boundaries. At the same time, white settlers broke these new agreements by moving onto native lands illegally. By the late 1850s, white settlers began forcing Native Americans out of Kansas and Nebraska, and then out of southern Colorado in the 1860s. As this occurred, white settlers also seized promised land to the Kiowa and Comanche tribes. Watching these developments, a Sioux chief, Spotted Tail, asked sarcastically, "Why does not the Great Father put his red children on wheels so that he can move them as he will?" End quote. After so many years of forcible removal, in the 1860s, the Sioux tribe in the Dakotas fought back against white encroachments on their land. This occurred after white settlers and gold miners began descending on the Dakotas in the 1860s, and the federal government announced it would build the Bozeman Trail through Sioux hunting grounds. The Sioux were successful at stopping that plan through forcible resistance, leading the U.S. government to pursue a peace agreement with them. However, in 1867, the federal government adopted a more aggressive policy to prevent these new prevent these type conflicts? Their answer was to convince Native American tribes to settle on smaller reservations and turn to growing crops rather than hunting buffalo. Few members of the Sioux accepted these government orders. Without the ability to pursue the way of life they knew, like hunting buffalo, they realized they would be stuck in poverty and isolation. With this understanding, the Sioux resumed warfare against the federal government on and off from 1868 to 1878. In the Northern Plains, for example, the Sioux resisted white explorers searching for gold in the Black Hills area, what would become known as the Black Hills Gold Rush. When the U.S. Army sent troops to put down this resistance, a famous battle occurred, the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana, from June 25th to June 26, 1876. That battle occurred between Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry Regiment and a massive grouping of Sioux warriors. Pursuing the Sioux into Montana, Custer sought to launch a surprise attack on what he thought was a small group of native warriors. He divided his 7th Cavalry Regiment into 3 battalions for a multi-wave assault. Custer, however, did not realize he was facing the entirety of the Sioux's warriors, some 2,500 men. Thus, the other groups of his regiment did not attack, and the Sioux decimated his part of the divided unit with only 250 soldiers. The entirety of his battalion, himself included, were slaughtered in what became known as Custer's last stand. Unfortunately for the Sioux, Custer's last stand created a wave of anger against Native Americans from the eastern part of the country. Within a few months, the U.S. government sent a much larger force, and 3,000 Sioux warriors were forced to surrender to the U.S. in October 1876. Some tribal leaders and warriors fled to Canada, but they, too, gave up by 1881. That was the last major war the federal government fought against Native Americans, but several smaller battles continued to occur in the West over the next 30 years. In the 1870s and 1880s, warfare died down in the West, but the federal government passed new policies on Native Americans that tried, yet again, to literally transform Native Americans into white citizens. In 1871, the U.S. stopped making treaties with Native American tribes, declaring that they were no longer separate nations. Thereafter, quote, Indian reform schools, end quote, such as the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, began the task of trying to force assimilate Native Americans. Other such schools opened in Kansas and on western reservations that tribes were forced onto. They forced Native Americans to speak English, to cut their hair, wear Western clothes, and give up tribal customs. Quote, kill the Indian to save the man, end quote, was what one Army officer said that founded the Carlisle School. In terms of federal law, the U.S. government also passed the Dawes Subtlety Act in 1887. With the goal of ending tribal life, it divided tribal reservations into small plots. Each native family would receive 160 acres, and single adults would receive 80 acres. Through this law, 47 million acres of land was distributed to Native Americans and their families. But that land was often desolate and not fertile for growing crops. On top of the Dawes Act, another key ending point of tribal life occurred when white settlers hunted buffalo to the point of extinction for leather hides and to intentionally destroy native life. Whites realized that by killing buffalo herds in their area, they would end the ability of Native Americans to live in that area. Quote, kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone, end quote, one Army officer was alleged to have said. From 1872 to 1874, professional hunters killed some 3 million buffalo a year. Within a decade, the buffalo were at the point of extinction. They were only saved after the Bronx Zoo brought buffalo to the zoo and prevented their extinction. By 1900, there were only 250,000 Native Americans left in the country, down from 600,000 in 1800. These Native Americans that survived endless fighting with white settlers and the federal government were doomed to isolation and poverty on reservations, with little to no economic opportunity or mobility. Unemployment and alcoholism would become major problems for Native communities. When we think of the United States' prosperity, we have to keep in mind how the expansion of this nation across the North American continent led to the near total destruction of Native American life. The entire United States bears the shame and guilt for those reverberating crimes. Thank you for listening.